Silence, fools! It's time for the silence spell. The silence spell. What a wonderful spell. Let's read it out. It's a pretty short spell, not nearly as long as the gate spells, but let's read it. For the duration, no sound can be created within or pass through a 20-foot radius sphere centered on a point you choose within range. Any creature or object entirely inside the sphere is immune to thunder damage, and creatures are deafened while entirely inside it. Casting a spell that includes a verbal component is impossible there. That's a pretty simple spell. I mean, it's horrible for spellcasters, obviously. It's pretty much used exclusively for that. But I'm going to tell you why today. It's a war crime, and everyone should be talking about this, and the fact that nobody is a crime. Alright, before we can talk about why the silence spell is a war crime, we actually have to figure out what the silence spell does. So, we're going to take out our physics magnifying glass, and we're not doing math today, but we're going to put the math brain in, and we're going to learn a little bit of science and figure out what it does in the first place. First things first, what is sound? Sound is a series of vibrations that travel in waves through other mediums like air or water. Essentially, an object will vibrate, like your vocal cords or an engine, and create regions of high and low pressure that result in waves that can travel through other mediums. Unlike light, which involves photons, which is like, that's its own fucking thing, looking at you, quantum mechanics, it isn't tangible and must, and I repeat this, must travel through other mediums in order to be heard. So if you have no air or water or metal or something for vibrations to go through, no sound. You got it. You're gonna get nothing. Second thing second, what is a vacuum? Hear me out. You'll see why I'm talking about this in a minute. A vacuum is a space devoid of matter. That's it. It's literally dead air minus the air, so it's just dead. Which, honestly, isn't too far from the reality, but we'll come back to that later. In a true vacuum, there are no particles of air or other chemicals. No oxygen, no carbon dioxide, no nitrogen, no nothing. It's just empty space. But it's very interesting empty space. So let's combine that information. Sound can only travel through another medium like air or metal or water, and a vacuum has no matter, aka no air inside of it. Therefore, we know that sound can't travel in a vacuum because there is no matter for it to travel through. So the silence spell must create a vacuum in an area, right? Wrong! That would be too easy. The silence spell can be cast underwater, and it's not like all the water would disappear. Have you ever heard of a DM ruling that? No, because it's stupid and mean. But Hannah, I hear you cry, you're thinking too much into this. It would probably just create a vacuum around all the creatures in the area. And to that I say, you ignorant fool. The spell specifically says any creature or object inside the area is entirely inside the sphere is immune to thunder damage, which means that it isn't just a deafening spell, but it prevents sound waves from traveling in it at all. But then, what does it do? It's not a vacuum, but it acts like a vacuum. What is it? To this, I propose a theory that solves this problem. The silence spell prevents the most prevalent medium, usually air or water, from interacting with other molecules. This means that the air or water would still exist, but that their molecules could not interact with one another. They would still exist to be subject to normal physical effects, but they could not touch each other and therefore could not pass vibrations, aka sound through them. This has some interesting effects on living creatures, but before we check out this fake vacuum's effect on people, let's take a closer look at what normal vacuums do to living creatures. Remember how I said that vacuums are really interesting empty space? It's because the lack of matter kind of fucks with organic creatures that enter that space. Pretty much everyone knows this because of the most famous vacuum in the universe, space. Though, to be technical, space isn't a true vacuum. There's just so little particles that it acts like a vacuum, but I digress. Astronauts have to wear fancy spacesuits to make sure they don't die when they're out there, and that's mainly because of 4 things. Number 1, you begin to suffocate. Because there's no no molecules, that means there's no air. And if there's no air, that means there's no oxygen, which becomes a problem when your body relies on oxygen for most of its bodily functions. So if you walked out into a vacuum, you would immediately begin to suffocate as your brain starved for oxygen. Number 2, you begin to suffocate? All right, I already said this one, but it gets worse. Because there are no molecules, that means there's no pressure. Fun fact, your lungs are able to take in air mostly due to air pressure. When you breathe in, the space inside of your lungs is at a lower pressure than the air outside of your body, meaning that the air wants to even out that pressure by entering your lungs. Your lungs then expand outwards, increasing its volume, drawing in more air until they're full and at equilibrium with the outside air pressure. Then they contract, decreasing its volume, increasing its pressure, pushing that air out of your lungs, and then getting ready for the next cycle. So when there is no pressure outside of your body, you can't actually breathe in. And instead, any gases inside of your body, under pressure inside of your body, will want to escape as fast as possible. Which brings us to number 3. Your lungs would explode. Well, maybe. If you don't breathe out, they will. Any extra air stored in your lungs will want to escape as fast as possible. So if you inhale and hold your breath while walking out into a vacuum, well, that has to leave somehow. And if you won't let it, it will find a way. And by far the craziest thing, number 4, you begin to boil. Not immediately or excessively at first, but you do begin to boil. You see, when a liquid, such as water, is at room temperature, highly energetic molecules will evaporate into gas extremely slowly, causing additional pressure to build up around you, kind of like a little vapor suit. This isn't a huge deal, as that vapor is usually reabsorbed into the liquid relatively soon after, creating a kind of dynamic equilibrium. But when the vapor pressure, or the pressure resulting from the evaporating water molecules, is reduced or completely removed, the boiling point of the liquid also decreases. This causes liquids like water to boil at, and I kid you not, negative 61.78 degrees Celsius or negative 90 degrees Fahrenheit when in a vacuum. Now, this all sounds bad, and it kind of is, but let me assure you that when you boil, it won't actually be hot, because the particles that are leaving have the highest energy, which is the main source of heat. So actually, you'll be getting progressively colder the longer you boil. That's nice, right? So now that we know the effects of a real vacuum, let's compare that to the qualities of our fake vacuum to see which ones translate over. In a fake vacuum, the air particles don't actually get removed from the area, so you won't suffocate from lack of oxygen, at the least. Instead, you'll suffocate from a lack of air pressure around you, as your lungs will be unable to overcome the pressure differential to bring oxygen into your body. Then there's the fact that there's no air pressure, which also means your lungs can and will explode if you don't breathe out. You'll still boil as the vapor and air pressure around you approach 0, but hey, at least you get a little bit of a cool down in the heat of battle. Isn't that nice? Don't you want that? Like you're fighting Asmodeus? No? Okay. Well then. Alright, I just ranted to you for a long time about vacuums, so here's the totally exact and precise science, how that all could be translated to D&D speak. Warning, I am probably not your DM and cannot control the rulings that your own DMs might make. Respect your DM's rulings and only point out after the session has finished the scientific evidence that they should have based their fantasy game decisions on. So number 1, when the spell is cast, you need to breathe out as soon as you can to avoid your lungs exploding, or at least, expanding so rapidly as to cause pain. So make a dexterity saving throw of DC 10. I don't know. It's not particularly difficult to, breathe out. But if you don't do it in time or decide to hold your breath, that can be extremely painful. because you won't have lungs soon. So in terms of damage, I would say maybe like 3d6 force damage on the top of your turn if you fail to save, and then voluntarily release your breath as a free action. I mean, it's not that bad. But number 2, you can't hold your breath if your lungs are going to explode. If you do, I mean, you could, but I wouldn't recommend it at all. Since you can't hold your breath, we get to talk about the fun part of the suffocation rules. That's right, can't escape the suffocation rules, which is when you run out of breath or are choking. So a character can survive a number of rounds equal to 1 plus their con modifier with a minimum of 1 round. This is actually pretty good news for you because of the area. So it's like, as long as you're not in like difficult terrain, or if you're not being grappled or restrained, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to get out of the silence area. If you are in difficult terrain and are, like, say, underwater and are not a super cool and awesome water race like the Tritons, love you, bros. I love you so much. And you can't swim, as long as you have a 1 or 2 to your modifier, you should still be alright, No guarantees though, since D&D is up to a chance of bullshit, so. But number 3, the most worrisome thing is that you'll begin almost immediately to boil. Except for, of course, inorganic beings. So unless there's really like not much you can do to avoid this one, unless of course you're like a warforged, which case you're just like made out of metal. So you still have to take it. I would say that you would take like 4d10 fire damage when the spell is first cast, and then 4d10 at the beginning or end of your turn, depending on like how nice your DM is feeling at the time. So things don't look great for you if you are inside the spear. The good news is that as long as you're not super low level or like a wizard or a sorcerer or something, there's a pretty high chance of survival here. Though I will admit, it does feel like a war crime. I mean, you're boiling someone alive while suffocating them under the threat that their lungs might explode. It feels like a war crime, and I can't prove that. But my intuition does say it feels like a war crime. And now, am I judging you for doing it? Yes, but do it anyway. If you want to commit a war crime, I guess. Next question.